Hey there folks, I'm Matt Easton of the Scholar Gladiatoria channel and school, and I'm here to talk about Sir Richard Francis Burton. Now, some of you, I imagine quite a lot of you probably out there, haven't heard of Sir Richard Francis Burton, and some of you will instantly know who I'm talking about. So, Richard Burton was one of the most famous characters, shall we say, of the second half of the 19th century. He was one of the people involved in searching for the source of the Nile. He was the person to first translate the so-called Arabian Nights and the Kama Sutra. So he was a writer, an explorer. He's also known as being a fencer, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in a minute. But I really want to just say, before I go into what I'm specifically going to talk about here, which is about his book, which I have a facsimile of here, which is A New System of Sword Exercise by Sir Richard Francis Burton, or just Richard Francis Burton. Before I go into that, I just want to say that I do personally have quite a few issues with Richard Burton. I know he has his followers. There's entire websites and fan groups and all kinds of stuff devoted to Burton and his life. And I think that's partly due to the way that he's been portrayed in the 20th century, particularly in fiction. He's been portrayed as this dare-doing kind of slightly kind of sexy character who kind of did what he wanted, and he didn't live by the norms of the time, and he was kind of ruggedly handsome and adventurous, and you know, a great lover and a linguist and a poet and a scholar and everything else. And he was definitely some of those things, without a shadow of doubt. He seems to have really liked sex. Nothing wrong with that. He's also seems to have been a fantastic linguist. I think there's no doubts or aspersions being cast there. However, he did do certain things, some of which were actually very controversial and actually probably held him back in society in the 19th century, which had been largely kind of ignored or brushed under the carpet in the 20th and 21st centuries. And additionally, he did say lots of things which were certainly a product of his time, but which would be considered massively politically incorrect now, and wrong, frankly. And I'm not going to focus on the political side of things, because I've done enough of that recently, I think. But in terms of things he said that were wrong, if you look at, for example, Burton's Book of the Sword, which was supposed to be, well, he published it and it was supposed to be the first of either two or a series of volumes about the history of swords. There is a lot of bullshit in that book. One of the problems I have with Burton is where he didn't know about something but wanted to be seen to know about something, he just made shit up. And so, you know, admittedly, we are in a scholarly position in the 21st century now where we can say things about Egyptian swords that it wasn't possible for someone in the late 1800s to know about, because they didn't have the data set, they didn't have the ability, the scholarship, essentially the 100 and plus years, 150 years, nearly 140 years of scholarship that we have. They didn't have that to benefit from. So, for example, Sir Samuel Merrick was the sort of late 19th century expert on armour, and he was, for his time, an expert. But if you look at what he was writing then, if you look at it now, you realise a lot of what he wrote was wrong. And unfortunately, that's true of Burton. But I would say Burton is far more... I wouldn't put Merrick anywhere. I don't want anyone to think I'm putting Merrick in the same category as Burton. I'm not. Merrick was a scholar. And Burton, unfortunately, was, to my opinion, not scholarly enough in some areas. I'm not saying that's true of everything. As I say, he was a great linguist, and there were certainly areas where he did know a lot about. But unfortunately, he did have a tendency to say things about things that he didn't really know anything about. And some people will say, Matt, you do that as well. Well, I try not to, and I try to admit when I don't know something. And that's something that Burton never did. And that's probably why he sort of rubs on me, why I find him a bit abrasive, because he never, ever seems to ever admit that he doesn't know everything about everything. I'd also just point out, before going on onto the actual fencing material, that Burton also got into certain adventures and did certain quite famous things actually where there are no independent Western witnesses. So for example, he allegedly went to Mecca. He was allegedly one of the first in relatively modern times, one of the first Westerners to go to Mecca on pilgrimage. Did he actually do that? Did he? We don't really know. He probably maybe did. Also, he fell out with John Hanning Speke about the source of the Nile. There were certain things about that whole series of expeditions that kind of don't add up. His account of the attack on the group that they were in by Somali tribesmen doesn't really, there's something that's a bit fishy about it. The fact that he says he couldn't get to his revolver and he had to fight his way out with his sword, it all smacks a little bit of swashbuckling. What we can say is he took a spear in the face because he had the scar from it, but did it pan out like he said? We don't know, because for some reason he was separated from all of the other Europeans and they didn't see what he was up to. You know, he also gives accounts of where he fenced with some local tribes people, and they were rubbish and didn't know what they were doing, and I made them look silly and showed what a great fencer I was. Did that happen? We just don't know. The problem is, so many of his stories, he's the only person who's able to recount this to us. Right, now let's get onto the actual swordsmanship material. Now, the new system of sword exercise, let's put that in context. So in context, why is it a new system of sword exercise? Well, he spends a good chunk of this book criticising Angelo. Who was Angelo? Henry Angelo was the superintendent of sword exercise. His manual of 1817 was continuously republished throughout the 19th century and was the regulation manual for the use of the sword on foot in all of the British Empire, and it was also applied to police swords. It was applied to people in Canada and Australia and India and everywhere else in the British Empire. This was the go-to manual for how to use a sabre on foot. And Henry Angelo definitely knew what he was talking about. He was a fencing master who was the son and grandson in a fencing dynasty that ran the Angelo Academy of Arms in Soho, London, and they definitely knew how to fence. There's no question about that. But Burton's very critical of Henry Angelo's manual, which, bear in mind, had been used by officers and used by the military from 1817 right the way through to 1874. Okay. So it had been in use for a long period of time. Can't do the maths that quickly in my head, but a long period of time throughout basically the biggest chunk of the 19th century. But Burton really lays into it, and I'm not going to go into his criticisms. I'll maybe save that for another video. But I'm going to use one piece of evidence from this manual to display how I think that Burton was sometimes a bit of an idiot. So putting down the facsimile of the Burton's new system of sword exercise for a second, what I have here are two books, and they're actually both the same. One's hardcover and one's softcover, but they are both original copies of Angelo's infantry sword exercise, and they're both the 1845 edition. Okay, so it was revised slightly. They just changed the layout and they changed a few of the words, but fundamentally it stayed the same from 1817 right the way through to 1874. And this is what Burton's criticising. And if I just open one of these, why have I got two? Well, basically because I saw one, I had one already and I saw another one for a good price, so I bought it, because they don't come up very often. So when I see these things, I like to grab them. Now, if we turn to this page here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move closer to the camera and make the camera focus on the page. So you will see here, so get my face behind, you'll see here this is a circle, and there are swords shown on here which show guard positions. Okay, but equally we've got lines, and these correspond to the cuts. Okay, so we've got cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. Okay, so what they literally are cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 to the top of the head, or down the middle rather. I'll explain that in a second. There was incidentally in some systems a cut 8 which was straight upwards, but they pretty much neglected that in Angelo's system. My personal opinion is you don't really need cut 7, and in fact Waite mentions that kind of in his book, but again that's something for another time. But fundamentally this is a good numbered cutting system. This first appears in John Gaspard Le Marchand's cavalry sword exercise of 1796. So Angelo himself didn't invent this, he took it from a regulation work that was from 20 years earlier than his 1817 book, okay, 21 years earlier. But it's an incredibly useful method of numbering cuts. Why is it useful? Because it makes it really easy. If I say, for example, oh, I gave a cut number 1 to his thigh, and then it wounded him, but he returned at me with an afterblow that was a cut number 3 at my underneath of my arm, but I managed to parry that, and I responded with I could say a 0.1 and a 0.2 because the thrusts are numbered as well, or I could return with a cut number 7 to the top of his head, and that wounded him, and I managed to finish him off with a heavy cut number 5 to his neck, which chopped his head off and blood spurted all over the ceiling. So it means that I can easily describe an angle of cut and add that to a location. So it's actually a very efficient way of explaining to someone what to do in class, or giving someone an account, even giving the police an account of what happened in a fight. And you'll notice that the guards were also numbered. Very, very simply put, a cut number 1 is like this, and a guard number 1 is like this, because it's the guard that guards against cut number 1. And Hutton was still using this system way later in the 1890s as well. It was completely normal, and in fact, when we read non-fencing sources from Britain or the British Empire, you'll very often see that in these accounts they will refer to the cut numbers. One minor detail before I go on to Burton is that these numbered cuts are also used in Filipino martial arts. And my good friend Mr. Matt Gallus, he has some theories about how maybe the numbered cuts came from British military sabre through the Peninsular War over to Spanish military sabre, and then from Spanish into the Philippines. There's a lot more work and research to be done on that. The earliest documented manual or treatise that we have with these numbered blows is Le Marchand, who, despite his French sounding name, he was from an old French family, but he was British, and his book's from 1796. We don't have anything in print from before that that has these numbered blows in. Now, before I move on to Burton, everyone in the British Empire, I thought, understood these numbered blows, okay? They are cut directions. They are not cut locations, okay? And that's very, very important. So I could do a cut number 1 at your head, or I could do a cut number 1 at your arm, or a cut number 1 at your thigh, okay? And what might that equate to? So if we're fencing each other with sabres, a cut number 1 at your head would be up here, a cut number 1 at your arm would probably be down there if you were on guard in terce, and a cut number 1 at your leg would be down there. But all of these are the same blow. They're a downwards diagonal blow from the right to the left. That's cut number 1. A cut number 2 would be from the left to the right, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a very clear and simple, excellent system, I think. It doesn't need replacing, doesn't need updating, doesn't need changing. But Burton disagreed. So Burton was hell-bent on criticising Henry Angelo's manual. Now, when you've read all of Burton's manual, you realise, well, why did I read that? Okay, it has some interesting bits in it, and if you're interested in British military sabre, or indeed just military sabre of any nationality, it's worth reading once, okay? But do not base your classes on it, do not base your school or your personal methodology on it, because it's not a good system. I would say it's not even a system, okay? It's got a number of ridiculous things in it that I would just tear out the book and throw out of the window or burn or something. But here is the bit, I'm just focusing on this specific bit, here is the bit where he talks about the circular target, the one we just saw in Angelo, okay? Burton says, I am opposed to almost every page of this unhappy brochure, that's Angelo's infantry sword exercise, especially to the 7 cuts and guards of the target. To the shape of the target, I never yet saw a man that was perfectly or absolutely circular. What? What did you just say, Sir Richard Francis Burton? You think that because the cutting target is circular, that means that the person is circular? Well, like, oh God, this is to do with directions. There are only 360 degrees that you can give a cut from, okay? Now we could number the cuts from 1 to 360, or we could say they're infinite, which wouldn't be very useful. 6 or 7 is enough. If I say to my students, give a cut number 2 to their shoulder, everybody in the room knows that that means a downwards cut from the left to the right onto the opponent's shoulder. Boom. That's all you need to say, okay? It's got nothing to do with a circular person, like a big, imagining like kind of like Humpty Dumpty or something. What was Burton even thinking of? He's actually, I'm just going to read that to you again. I'm opposed to almost every page of this unhappy brochure, especially to the 7 cuts and guards of the target, to the shape of the target. I never yet saw a man absolutely circular. I have to say, I think I have seen a few people who are absolutely circular, but that's not the point. The point is like, what are you talking about, Richard, Dickie? That's not the point of the target. The point of the target is about directions of a cut. It's not about the shape of the thing you're hitting. So that would be bad enough that he made that throwaway comment. And to me, it's tantamount to a lie. Okay, it's anybody who knew about sabre fencing or the infantry sword exercise would read that and go, ha. I thought that was funny, but actually that makes no sense. Like, I don't understand it. He had been in the army. He may have got kicked out of the army for messing around in brothels in Karachi, but that's another story. He was in the army. Surely, you know, he's supposed to be a fencer. He's supposed to, allegedly, have been recognised as a master at arms, a maître d'armes in Paris. Is that true? Has anyone verified that? Anyway, that's what he claimed, or other people claimed. He's supposed to be a fencer, he's supposed to be a swordsman and adventurer who fought off Somalian tribesmen with his sabre because he couldn't get to his revolver and no one else saw this. And he's supposed to have been an awesome expert on authority on the sword, despite the fact that Hutton, Castle, Matthey, Waite, all of the other real experts of swords in that period never seemed to have any involvement with Burton or ever mention him. Anyway, let's leave that aside. You can see how I feel a bit about Burton. And I may be wronging him. As I just remind you, I do believe he was great at some things, and he's certainly an interesting character. Fencing, I'm not so sure. So that would be bad enough, okay, if he is besmirching the legendary status of Henry Angelo, who was a real fencing master, who ran one of the most successful swordsmanship schools in, I was going to say in Britain, but possibly in Europe, certainly for the military sabre in the 19th century. And who was one of Henry Angelo's personal students? Captain Alfred Hutton, who was universally recognised in the British Empire as an expert on swords and swordsmanship, and actually genuinely was. And he was a founder of the London Fencing Club and all kinds of other stuff, and wrote lots of very, for the time, very, very good books and some good manuals that make perfect sense and are perfectly good to run a class from now. Not so much Cold Steel, incidentally. Try and look at The Swordsman, I'd recommend. Right, but coming back to Burton, so you'd think that was enough, that he'd insulted Henry Angelo. Like crazy. If you're going to insult anyone, it'd be like, you know, it'd be like me insulting like PewDiePie's YouTube channel for being like rubbish. Well, I might think that, but look how many subscribers he's got. Okay, it's just stupid. Okay, Henry Angelo was universally respected and what he wrote was good stuff. But now let's go. Burton went one step further. He decided, I don't like this circular man target because I've never seen a circular man. So instead, he created this. That's right. He created a man-shaped target with, you know, it's got some guard positions on it. I don't have any problems with those. But with all of the cuts, he's put so many cuts in there. So cut 1 is specifically a cut down on the head, that's fine. Cut 2 is a cut down on the other side of the head. Then cut 3 is a horizontal cut at the side of the head. Cut 4 is a horizontal cut at the other side of the head. Cut 5 is a kind of cut like this on the shoulder. Cut 6 is a cut like that on the other shoulder. Cut 7 is a cut here at the upper arm. Cut 8 is, and it goes on and on and on. He's got 12 cuts. 12 cuts that are not only angle specific, but also location specific. I'm just going to put this up here again for you. Okay, so the cuts are to a specific place and with a specific angle. And the problem is he's totally missed the point. The 6 or 7 cuts on a circular diagram means that you can cut any angle and describe it as one of those cuts. And you can say the location, a cut 2 to the head or a cut 4 to the inner thigh, whatever. But by doing this, he's made a system that's drastically worse. He's said that he's being more specific, but he's actually succeeded in being completely unspecific, because now, how do I describe a cut for an upwards cut at the inner leg? He doesn't have one. In actual fact, he doesn't have any cuts at the leg. He has no cuts at the leg. Like, it's so wacky, this manual, that it's hilarious that it ever got published. And I also hasten to point out, for anyone who says, oh, Burton was famous, but Matt, how can you possibly question his genius? This book was never adopted by anyone. No one, as far as I can tell, ever studied it or ever used it for anything. Hence, when you find an original copy of Burton's new system of sword exercise, it's incredibly expensive. Number one, because it's Burton, and Burton has all of these fanboys and fangirls. But secondly, because there aren't many of them, because everyone looked at it and went, what a load of shit. Right, anyway, so there we go. He created a system which he thought was better, but was incredibly a lot worse. And in doing so, he illustrated that he didn't even understand, not that he didn't understand Angelo's manual, that he didn't understand possibly the simplest thing in Angelo's manual. And it wasn't even from Angelo. That cutting diagram had been around since 1796, and everyone who did swordsmanship understood it. So there we go. Burton's new system of sword exercise. Fricking awful. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.